Hi everyone, welcome back. Welcome to lecture 2.1, where we will be discussing the themes in biology as well as the methods of investigating biology. Before we get to the lecture content though, let's talk a bit about lecture question 1.2 that we left you with the end of last lecture. You were supposed to identify what are the components that help foster learning while you're doing workshop outside of workshop. Now, if you said A, great. Now, if you didn't say A, though, that's not a big deal. Let's figure out why the answer is A together by kind of breaking this question down a little bit. Now, before we get started, what was my recommendation for dealing with any question that you come across in general biology? What's the first thing you should probably do? If you said ignore all the stuff at the bottom, you'd be correct. Great. So before we get to that stuff, let's first actually break down what the question is asking us. Now let's see here. It's asking about kind of workshop outside of workshop, so we're going to need some kind of giving us some context, right? And it's saying that we should do workshop outside of workshop many times. Again, more context. So at the very least, we should have some understanding of what workshop outside of workshop means. And if you don't know what that means, definitely go ahead and watch the last little bit of lecture 1.2. I think I actually even bookmarked that little section so you can go in and rewatch what workshop outside of workshop means. Anyway, so ultimately though, it seems to be mostly be asking about what's fostering learning, right? So what does fostering learning mean and what does that involve? Well, let's kind of look at these options down here, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and see which of these we think are involved in fostering learning. Let's think about the things from lecture 1.2 that would inform this answer, starting with number 1, spatial summation. Now, if you remember, spatial summation involves interacting with information in diverse ways to increase transmission rate of a signal or the signal associated with that information. So ultimately that's kind of the ultimate goal of learning content, right? So I think it's probably safe to say that spatial summation is involved in the learning process. Definitely. Okay, definitely involved in fostering learning. Okay, what about long-term potentiation here, number 2? Well, that's definitely critical to learning. After all, it is the process of reinforcing new memories by retrieving and encoding those memories, retrieving from the long-term memory and then encoding them back into the long-term memory. So retrieving from long-term into short-term, encoding from short-term into long-term. Okay? So I think it's probably... well, not probably, it's definitely involved in fostering learning, right? Okay, how about temporal summation? Well, that's using the same kind of neural pathway over and over and over again. And I would argue that's probably a good one to include in fostering learning. And also, the question gives you a bit of a hint here. It says, doing workshop outside of workshop many times. So, I would argue that's also a pretty good hint here to include temporal summation in the things that are going to answering this question, right? So let's finally get down here to passive learning. Well, I think it's pretty clear that passive learning is not really involved in workshop outside of workshop. Right? We talked very much about how active you're talking with people, you're drawing organizers, you're listening to people, you're, using your hands, so on and so forth. So I think it's pretty clear that workshop outside of workshop is not a passive learning process. So we can ignore that one. And now that we have all kind of our ducks in the row and our answer options, we just want to look for an answer that has 1, 2, 3, but not 4. And there we go. Now we're left with A. So, pretty straightforward. Really just requires you to understand the content from last lecture, right? So, what spatial summation means, what long-term potentiation means, what temporal summation means, and how those all integrate with both learning and the workshop. Okay. Pretty straightforward. Hopefully not too bad. Let's move on here to the lecture content for today. Lecture 2.1, Themes in Biology and Methods of Investigating Biology. Starting with evolution, kind of the core theme and unifying theme of biology. Now, evolution basically states that living organisms are modified descendants of a common ancestor. In other words, we are all descendants. We are descended from the same things that elephants are, if you go back far enough, or heck, fungi. We're descended from the same thing that fungi are descended from, if you go back far enough. In fact, we call that the common ancestor of all life. So we're going to talk a lot more about evolution later on in the semester, but what it does for us is it allows us to say that, look, there's not only a lot of diversity in life, there's not a lot of diversity of living organisms that exist now and have existed, but we can also understand how those things were related to each other and how they derived, right, from the, again, same common ancestor. So it's pretty critical to our understanding of biology, and again, it's this kind of core unifying theme of biology. Another theme in biology that you may not be quite as familiar with as evolution is the property of emergence. Now, emergent properties are the idea that the parts, when you put them together, develop things that are totally different, or properties that are totally different than when the parts are by themselves. Let's take some examples here that might kind of clarify what I'm talking about. For example, we have 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom, and by themselves, they don't really do anything, right? They're just kind of inert gases. Or, a little more explicitly here, let's look at a bike down here, right? So we have all these pieces of a bike all laid out, and you can't really do much with these pieces of a bike, right? So this bike chain doesn't really do much for you. You maybe swing it around. You could roll the wheel, of course, but you could sit on the seat. It's probably more comfortable than the ground, but depending on the bike, maybe not. Alone, or as just kind of in this mess together here, they don't really do much. But when you assemble these pieces in a particular way, you get new properties that emerge, right? So the bike pieces, for example, now that you've assembled these bike pieces, you actually have a functioning bike that you could ride, that could roll, that can do all these things that you definitely couldn't do with just the parts themselves. So riding a bike is an emergent property of the bike pieces. Okay. Similarly, we have 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. Now, when you combine these to form a water molecule, that water molecule has lots of emergent properties that we're actually going to get to in a little bit, but that do very different things than the constituent parts of hydrogen atoms and oxygen atoms have on their own, right? Now, this applies to a lot of things in general biology, or biology in general, including how we organize or structure biological organisms and biological communities, and talk about the hierarchy of biological life. For example, you can see down in this figure, you have organisms, right? So say a tree. Now, a single tree has a different set of properties that describe it than, say, a whole population of trees. These properties, or if you put lots of different populations of trees, of different trees together, so you take a population of maples and a population of oaks and you put them together, well, now they form a community of a forest. Now, when you have lots of different forests, you have a forest here of oaks and maples, you have a field here of grasses, you have a pond over here. Those are different ecosystems. And when you have different ecosystems together, they have their own unique properties now that they are starting to interact. And then finally, you have unique properties of the whole biosphere when you evaluate it as a whole. So you find emergence kind of comes about in lots of different fashions and lots of different spheres or ways to view the world, right? So organisms have different properties than the populations they're part of. Water has different properties than the constituent molecules that it's made of. Bikes have different properties than the parts that the bike is made of, and so on and so forth. Now, there's actually, if you want to do some look into this a little more, emergence has a lot of really interesting kind of phenomena associated with it. Actually, if you've ever heard of the program Radiolab, it's a podcast. They have a whole episode about emergence that's really fascinating. It talks about things like how people and communities have emergent behaviors where, their decision making is, if you look at their decision making as an emergent behavior, it is actually sometimes better than the decisions of the individual in the group. If you look at, there's some really cool examples of fireflies. They talk about emergent properties where fireflies in huge numbers will actually start blinking together in the same pattern. But when you separate them, they'll have their own pattern. And then the more that come together, the more synchronized their pattern gets. So there's some really cool examples of what emergence is. If you check out that Radiolab episode, which I'll see if I can dig up the link for it and drop it in the video sometime, or at the least in the comments. Okay. Now, anyway, so we kind of finished off talking about these kind of structures and hierarchical organization of life and how they group things together, and that has its own kind of unique properties, right? Organisms, populations. Well, that actually happens to be one of the other important themes in biology, these kind of levels of biological organization. So it follows figure 116 has this nice kind of pattern that it follows where you can look at kind of increasing complexity of life as different components are put together to form kind of this next hierarchical level. So for example, you start out with organelles here, which are kind of these components we're going to talk about in just a few lectures. So you have these organelles like a nucleus or the cell wall or a endoplasmic reticulum. You'll know what all that means in a little bit. So these organelles, you put these organelles together and you get a cell. Now you take a bunch of different cells, you put all these different cells together and you start developing tissues like the human skin or muscle tissue or bone tissue. Now, when you take lots of different tissue types and combine them, you can actually start making organs or organ systems. Okay? And of course, if you take a bunch of particular organ systems together, you actually develop a organism. Okay? So if I were to just take like a pile of bones, this is kind of gruesome, I think, maybe, but if I were to take like a pile of bones and a liver and a spleen and all that stuff and just put them into a pile, right, that wouldn't necessarily make a living being or a human, but because they're assembled in a particular way, in a particular fashion, and develop, yada yada, now you have a emergent property that is a human or a living organism, right? So now that we have organisms, you have lots of these same organisms together that forms a population, such as the population of trees that we had mentioned before, like a population of oak trees, or population of wolves living in Yellowstone National Forest, right? Or National Park. No, it's not really a forest. Whatever. So those would be populations. Now, if you have different populations of different organisms coexisting, right, now you're talking about a community. So you have a community of organisms. And that could be all the different communities of trees, but that could also be, say, like looking at the oak trees and how they interact with the deer, for example. Right? Those are something you definitely find in New Jersey. So now you have a whole community system. So you'd have a forest, would be a community of both the trees and animals that live in the trees and so on and so forth. Now when you have you have a forest here and a wetland here and a field over here, together they'd be considered an ecosystem. And then when you look at all the ecosystems in the world, all at the same time, you consider that the biosphere. Okay? So this is how you can kind of break down the hierarchy of life to kind of look at its constituent parts and then understand how they fit together. It's a critical theme in biology because it helps us kind of build structure around what we talk about, so we can kind of be more careful and maybe break down some of the emergent properties that we see in these different levels. Now, of course, there's some question of, right, so we understand these different themes, we understand kind of what they are, but how do we learn more about these themes? How do we learn more about evolution, or how emergent properties develop, or how do we learn more about different organisms or communities, right? Well, we use the scientific method.